I was mentioning I was unfortunate enough to be grown up in a communist country. I'm not going to tell you anything what I heard on the radio or read in books. Whatever I'm telling you is personal experience of my parents, relatives, and people I knew. A little historical background. Most of you probably don't know. Hungary is a small country in the middle of Europe, and before World War II, it had a political system of parliamentary democracy, kind of similar to the British setup. We even had, or Hungary even had a, not really a monarch, but it's called the governor, who was the head of the state, but there were numerous parties, political parties. There was a parliament, and they formed the government, and they run the country. As far as economical system, it was capitalist. However, the industry was kind of limited. It was mostly agriculture. But the means of production were in the hands of private citizens. Now, during World War II, Hungary was a reluctant and limited ally of Nazi Germany. So when the Russian occupied Hungary at the end of World War II, they were determined to fundamentally transform the country. So in the shadow of the Soviet army, they kind of staged an election, and lo and behold, the Communist Party got the most votes. So they, even though on paper they still existed probably another dozen political parties. The first thing they did is, once the communists got into power, is to abolish political parties. There was no other political party was allowed to function. So they went around and arrested enormous number of people who were in the so-called opposition party leaders, people who had land, more land than what the communists thought they should have. Anybody who tried to not even organize, just voice opposition against the communist government were persecuted mercilessly. Even one of the church leader, who was a cardinal, and he didn't criticize the political system, he only voiced his opposition or disapproval of the atrocities what the communists did. And next thing we know, he was in front of a court, lifetime jail. So that was the political system. The Communist Party, the Central Committee of the Communist Party, was the actual governing force. The parliament still existed with full of communist or allied members, but they were nothing more than just rubber stamping the Central Committee, Communist Central Committee's orders. The next move was the land confiscation. The leaders, the communist leaders, determined that anybody with X amount of land is exploiting other people, they can't have that. So they took all the landowners' lands, and in order to have the people on the farms not to rebel right away, they promised them that we're going to distribute the land. We're going to take from the rich, take their land, and then we'll distribute to equally to the people. And that's what they did. They took the rich people's land and distributed it. And as soon as they were done with the distribution, they said, well, it is not going to really work well. Why don't we just put it all together and the government will own it and you just work on a field. So there were millions of people, peasants, who all through their life or through generations they were dreaming of having their own little land where they can work for themselves and be in a little business. And they were obviously terribly disappointed, and a lot of people left the land, they moved to the cities, got employment in factories and so forth. So the result was that the food production, agricultural production, it just hit the bottom. Hungary used to be one of the breadbasket of Europe, and after the nationalization and socialization of the agriculture, there were food shortages for years and years. 6-7 years after World War II was over, there was still a lot of basic food stuff was rationed. Bread, flour, cooking oil, sugar, the basic stuff. There wasn't enough for the people, so it was rationed. As far as the business is concerned, the government with military help went around and simply confiscated every business, from the mom and pop shop, little grocery store or vegetable stand, to the 25,000 people, employed 25,000 people, huge factories. Just walked in, 4 or 5 people with military guards, and they said, from today, the people own this factory, or the people own this shop, or the people own this business. And simply, the owners of those businesses had to walk out and find their way to make a living. Now, very small businesses like barber shops, tailor shop, and things like that, there were not really anybody employed except the owner. There was nothing to take, so they just forced them into a collective. Instead of have your own cobbler shop or your own bakery, they put them all in one place, and from that point on, they weren't working for themselves, they were working for the people. So, obviously, they confiscated all the firearms, although in Hungary there was never the kind of firearm culture than in the US. But there were a number of people, especially out in the countryside, who did hunting. They had hunting rifles, single shot or double barrel, nothing sophisticated. But everything was confiscated because simple people, ordinary people, should not have any kind of firearms. So from this point on, the political and economical system was totally under the control of the Communist Party, and everything owned by the state. From the smallest shop to the largest factories, and all the land was owned by the state. They controlled education, healthcare, anything and everything was totally under the control of the Communist Party. Now, obviously, they knew that the upcoming generation is the one they were counting on, so the educational system was totally directed from the top down. There was no religious education whatsoever. Although before World War II, religious education was mandatory, because in Hungary, the vast majority of the people are Catholics. So even in public schools, they were religious education. The other thing they were proceeding to do is diminish or erase the patriotic feeling what the people had for their country and their history and so forth. So they were in the curriculum and in all the media, it was the negative things were emphasized. How bad the Hungarian government or Hungarian people treated the minorities, 50 years ago or 100 years ago, and how they treated the Jews before World War II. And so they were trying to make you feel guilty, that you're guilty about your nationality and your patriotism. A very good example, March 15 was, for over 100 years, the biggest national holiday, because that was to commemorate 1848, when the Hungarian people rise against the Habsburg monarchy. And this holiday immediately became a non-national holiday. In the schools, they still had some little commemoration and so forth, but basically they were trying to erase every kind of nationalistic, patriotic feeling of the upcoming generation. I was thinking that it's kind of similar or be on the same level if the US was trying to force Japan to celebrate the day when the nuclear bomb was dropped on it. They made the Hungarian people celebrate the day when the Russian army occupied the country. That day when it was finally taken over, that was the biggest national holiday. In all practical purposes, Hungary became a part of the Soviet Union, of the Soviet Empire. They built the infamous Iron Curtain, total media control. Traveling was extremely restricted, only to neighbors, other communist countries. There was no traveling to the West, not even the Soviet Union, because they knew better that you don't want people to come and see here and find out what ahead of them. I did meet several people who, on business or on other maybe athletes, were traveled to the Soviet Union, and everybody who came back from there said, if you want anybody to stay communist, don't let them go to the Soviet Union. As far as everyday life was extremely bleak. It was very evenly, everybody was miserable. There were no rich people other than the party functionaries, and they were so far away from the ordinary people. The only time you can see them when on April 4th of the big celebration, they were up on a podium, kind of similar to what you've seen. We're doing it in Moscow, and Brezhnev and Khrushchev and all those guys were sitting on it. Basically, everything was directed by the Soviet Communist Party through their Hungarian representative. Even in factories and larger offices and obviously in the military, they were Russian advisors everywhere. And a large occupational force was in Hungary all the time. So as far as said, everyday life was very bleak. If you wanted to buy a pair of shoes, once you saved up the money, you had a choice of going to shoe store number 1 or shoe store number 2 or shoe store number 3, but they all had the same thing. For the same price, same limited availability. There was totally hopeless of thinking that you ever save up enough money to open your own business or do something on your own. There's no such thing. The only people who knew what the other system looks like were our parents, the older generation. Unfortunately, they were so afraid to even educate their own children about a freer society because the terror was so unbelievable. If somebody found out that just a simple thing, an innocent 10 years old kid would have said in a school, hey, my dad told me that this is not right, we should have the ability to do this or that, the parents would have disappeared in a hurry. There were hundreds of thousands of people who just were thrown into jail as political prisoners. If you were unfortunate, you wind up somewhere in Russia in a salt mine or something like that. People were disappearing, saying a bad political joke, which will, make fun of the communist leaders. They were taken away in the middle of the night. So everybody lived in fear and a totally hopeless life. Fortunately, even despite the fact that people had no way of organizing and never mind using arms against the government, in 1956 there was still a huge uprising against the communist regime, and unfortunately the West blew the chance to break up the communist empire at that time, and they let the Russians bring in more and fresh troops and put down the but that's a totally different story. These real tough, tyrannical times I'm talking about, they were mostly, or they were really between World War II and 1956. After 1956, it was, the political system was still, and the economic system, it was the same, but the terror, the tyranny was a little bit reduced. And that's all I have to say right now, and thank you very much for listening.
May I ask Tibor a question?
Yeah.
How did you get out?
Well, it's kind of a long story. In 1956, when was the uprising, the borders were open. So my sister and her family left. The reason being not only to look for a better life, but my brother-in-law, my sister's husband, he was actually involved in the uprising. So he would have been caught and he would have been executed. So they came to the States in 1957, and once the letters started coming and the pictures, all the brainwashing what I received in school just evaporated in a hurry. Because finally I knew what else is there. Before that, nobody ever knew. Nobody knew. We didn't know we were poor because everybody was poor, and we didn't know that you can live any other way. So anyway, to make a long story short, they came to the States in 1957, and then in 1970, I asked for a passport to go to Italy as a tourist, went to Italy, and then defected from there.
Thank you, Tibor. I think our president needs to hear a few stories like that. So maybe I know some of you, like Gabriella, aren't old enough to remember, but I remember sitting at home and my my parents' house in 1960, 1961, and seeing the East Germans trying to go over the wall and being shot off that wall by the communist guards. So that's the reality of communism. And thanks again, Tibor. I want to introduce Mr. Ray Haynes.